This video contains minor spoilers for Nimona. You know what sucks? Being basically the only person on the planet for whom this movie isn't an absolute rave. Let me preface this by saying that whatever I'm about to say, I'm glad this movie exists. Very glad. And I'm glad that it seems to be doing praiseworthy numbers on Netflix. It's rare that an animated feature with this deep and lengthy of a production hell sees the light of day as something complete and watchable. So the mere fact that we have this movie is a victory, and a feat to be celebrated. Unfortunately, the thing about this kind of comeback story is that it can lead to a frankly unfair level of hype going into the actual picture. And while I try my best to go into these things with a blank slate, as it were, it really takes the wind out of my sails when I sit down with the actual movie and realize that, for the most part, Nimona is just a pretty decent movie for kids. And I mean the little kids. It's unfortunate because based on the little that I know of the original Nimona webcomic, this film definitely seems like it compromised and altered and toned down the story in many places to be more family-friendly. And as a result of that, left us with a story that's way more cookie-cutter and tame than it should be. I want to start with the positives because I think those are the parts of the movie that are most obvious. The animation is really, really nice. I was worried because the trailers used footage that featured a lot of bare backgrounds and I wasn't really sold on the character animation itself. But in its full context, it's actually very, very pretty and vibrant. It's distinct. It has lots of cool visual moments, and the action scenes are quite fun. On another note, the protagonists of the film, Ballister and Nimona, are very endearing and interesting characters. Granted, a lot of their early dialogue exchanges feel like they're hitting the same beats over and over again, but I've got more to say in a minute about what I think is generally pretty weak dialogue writing. It says a lot about the strength of the duo at their core that I came to love them despite this sense of repetition, and that I got invested in the peaks and valleys of their friendship despite the fact that you can totally see where those peaks and valleys are going to go from a mile away. I'd rewatch the movie just on the strength of their camaraderie. Nimona herself is really intriguing as this allegorical but also literally gender-fluid immortal gremlin child, and the way the film chooses to characterize her is this great mix of alien but simultaneously relatable to what I imagine will be a lot of people's life experiences and relationship to their own identity. Unfortunately, now we gotta talk about where I think some of the film's weaknesses lie, and talking about how you could see the drama between Nimona and Ballister coming, the story's not really anything you haven't seen before. That we have an openly gender-fluid and openly gay protagonist are, I think, interesting garnishes, but I imagine the savvy viewers will be able to call the plot point by point, down to the very last scene. For me, it was generic to the point of being a little distracting. Not to say that there's no surprising twists or turns to the story of Ballister being framed for the murder of his queen and reluctantly enlisting Nimona's help to clear his name. There were indeed some plot points that caught me just as off guard as it did the characters, but there's a lot of other plot turns or emotional beats that I feel I've seen executed better and more uniquely in other recent kids' films. And once it happens enough times, it really starts to weigh down on the movie. The movie's biggest weakness isn't really the story, though, it's the humor. And even that sounds worse than I want it to. It's not like there's a ton of horrible groaners. Every now and then there's a line that feels like it's trying a bit too hard, or for lack of a better word, just feels dated. But for the most part, it's just a matter of jokes that don't really land, the kind that pass right through me without being noteworthy at all. Which is fine in theory, but for the past 2 decades or so, Western animated movies have all basically been comedy by genre, and Nimona is no exception. And I think it needs to be said that when a movie is trying, often, to be funny, and just doesn't have the laugh-a-minute ratio to justify that effort. It doesn't help that a large chunk of the attempts at humor come from frickin' Todd. I hate this guy! And yes, I hate him in the sense that you're supposed to hate him, but I also just think he's an obnoxiously written character. He's obnoxious, but also the writing is obnoxious. Those are two different things, you know what I mean. He sucks the fun and investment out of every scene that he's in, which is a lot of scenes. Frankly, I don't think the moronic comic relief jockey douche bro is anyone's favorite character archetype, but there's ways to make it entertaining. This guy is just stuck between being a jerk and being a source of dumb jokes in such a way that I just want him off my screen every time he shows up. And then the movie tries to end by giving him a little redemptive moment to show that he's cool with our protagonist now, and it doesn't work for me at all, because the man never displayed a single remotely endearing or redeemable trait at any point in the entire picture beforehand. Maybe it would have worked if he were actually funny, but even then I kinda doubt it. Frankly, I genuinely hope that he'd just die. The other big point of interest to talk about here is the movie's world building. And boy, is interesting the right word here. I honestly can't tell you if I like or dislike the movie's approach to its setting. One where we've got weapons, clothing, and hierarchies that scream medieval, coexisting with futuristic tech and a culture and language that seems very contemporary, complete with lots of diegetic licensed music. It's a very deliberate mishmash that ends up feeling very arbitrary. It makes for a world that's unique, but not totally cohesive. And there were moments in the film where it genuinely took me out. Thematically, Nimona's largely a story about what it means to be a villain, why that role gets assigned to people, and the kind of background it takes for someone to deliberately accept such a label. Which, for a kids' movie, is really interesting. But then, even for a kids' movie, I think that a lot of that mainly only works on paper, and that the film could afford to dive a bit deeper on the subject. I think for a lot of little kids and animation buffs, Nimona's going to be a favorite. But I can only speak as myself, as someone who's seen a lot of what Nimona does story-wise done more interestingly in other films. So while I'll say that Nimona is something that I appreciate for its unique aesthetic, its implicit and overt queer representation, and the journey it had making it onto screens, it's not something that I'd personally call a great or very original movie. This is the worst kind of video to make because the people most likely to have even heard of this film are also the ones most likely to get angry at me for having this opinion. But if you've seen the movie, what did you think? Sound off in the comments, like the video if you liked, see you in the future.